Welcome to Silent Screams, where darkness, whispers, and terror await you. Are you ready to confront your fears? Story 1: The Marionette's Curse. When Melanie's grandmother passed away, the family inherited a trove of antiques from her dusty Victorian home. Among them was a doll, exquisitely crafted but undeniably eerie. It was a porcelain marionette with intricate, lifelike features and glassy blue eyes that seemed to follow you. Strings hung limply from its tiny wooden limbs, and its faded clothing hinted at an aristocratic past. The doll had a name etched onto its wooden base, Isabelle. Melanie's mother planned to sell it along with other items at an estate auction. But something compelled Melanie to claim the doll as her own. Despite the unease it gave her, she couldn't shake the feeling that the doll was meant for her. From the moment Isabelle entered their home, Melanie began to sense subtle changes, a whisper in the stillness, a fleeting shadow out of the corner of her eye. She dismissed these as tricks of her mind. But soon, it became apparent that Isabelle was no ordinary doll. The first night Isabelle sat on a shelf in Melanie's bedroom, strange occurrences began. At precisely 3 a.m., Melanie awoke to the faint sound of strings being plucked, like an eerie harp. The room was drenched in a cold that no amount of blankets could warm. She sat up, peering around the room. The moonlight cast long shadows, but nothing appeared out of place, until her eyes landed on Isabelle. The doll's head was slightly tilted, its glassy gaze now fixed directly on Melanie. "It's just a doll," Melanie muttered, convincing herself it had fallen over slightly when she moved the shelf earlier. She adjusted it and went back to bed. But as she lay there, the whispers began. Soft, indistinct murmurs that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The next day, Melanie mentioned the whispers to her best friend, Lila. "Maybe it's haunted," Lila joked, half serious. "Let's look it up." Together, they searched for the name Isabelle and Victorian marionettes. What they found chilled them. Isabelle had belonged to a traveling puppeteer named Victor Lacroix, infamous in the 1800s for his grotesque performances. Rumors swirled that his marionettes were cursed, crafted from the bones of the dead and bound with dark magic. Victor's troupe met a grisly end when his tent caught fire during a show. The flames consumed him and his puppets. But Isabelle had somehow survived. She was rumored to carry the souls of those lost in the fire, a vessel for their torment. Over the next week, Melanie's behavior changed. She became withdrawn and irritable. Her once vibrant personality dulled. Her mother noticed the shift and blamed it on stress. But Lila wasn't so sure. "Mel, you've been acting weird since you brought that doll home," Lila said during one of their rare hangouts. Melanie bristled. "It's just a doll. Stop making it a big deal." That night, Lila snuck into Melanie's room while she was asleep. She planned to take Isabelle and hide it as a prank. But when she touched the doll, a surge of cold shot through her hand. And a voice, low and guttural, whispered directly into her ear. "You shouldn't have done that." Lila screamed and dropped Isabelle, waking Melanie. But when Melanie turned on the light, the doll was back on its shelf, sitting as if nothing had happened. Melanie's nightmares became more vivid. She dreamed of being on a stage, strings attached to her limbs, forced to dance to a haunting melody. In the audience sat hundreds of shadowy figures, their faces blurred but their malevolence palpable. One night, she awoke to find Isabelle standing upright on her nightstand. The strings that should have been limp hung taut, as if an invisible hand was holding them. "Who's doing this?" Melanie screamed. backing into a corner. The room filled with an oppressive silence before a child's voice, sweet yet chilling, replied, "Play with me, Melanie." Desperate, Melanie and Lila sought help from a local historian, Mrs. Alder, who specialized in Victorian folklore. Mrs. Alder confirmed their fears. Isabel wasn't just cursed, she was a conduit for Victor Lacroix's spirit. "There's only one way to break the connection," Mrs. Alder said, her voice grave. "You must burn the doll. But beware, she will fight back." That night, Melanie and Lila prepared a bonfire in the woods. As the flames grew, the doll seemed to come alive. Its glass eyes darted between them, and its limbs jerked as if trying to escape. "You think you can destroy me?" a voice boomed. No longer childlike but deep and filled with rage. The air grew heavy, and the flames began to die out, as if snuffed by an unseen force. Lila screamed as her body was lifted off the ground. Her arms and legs contorted like a marionette. Melanie grabbed Isabel and threw her into the fire. The doll let out an ear-piercing shriek, and the ground beneath them trembled. Lila dropped to the ground, gasping for air as the flames engulfed Isabel. For a moment, it seemed over. But as the fire died, Melanie saw a figure in the smoke, Victor Lacroix, his eyes burning with hatred. "You freed me," he hissed. "But I'm not done." Before Melanie could react, the figure dissolved into the night, leaving only the charred remains of the doll. She and Lila stumbled back to the house, shaken but alive. Weeks later, Melanie's life began to return to normal. The nightmares stopped, and Isabel was nothing but ashes in the woods. But one evening, as she tidied her room, she noticed something on her shelf, a small, pristine marionette, its strings freshly tied, and its glassy blue eyes locked on hers. The name on its base read, "Victor." Story 2, The Curse of Annalise, A Haunted Doll's Tale. Nestled on the edge of a forgotten town stood an antique shop called Wicker's Relics, a place rumored to house artifacts with dark histories. Its owner, an eccentric old man named Elias, often spoke of the tales each item carried, but none compared to the chilling legend of Annalise. The porcelain doll locked away in a glass case at the back of the shop. The doll had delicate curls of auburn hair, eyes so vivid they seemed alive, and a red dress embroidered with gold. However, it wasn't her beauty that captured people's attention, it was the unsettling feeling of being watched, even when no one was around. Rumors whispered of misfortunes that befell those who dared touch her case. Some claimed to hear her giggle at night, others swore they saw her move. When aspiring journalist Mara Kane stumbled upon Wicker's Relics, she wasn't looking for trouble, she was chasing a story. Little did she know, she would uncover a chilling secret that would change her life forever. Mara's curiosity was piqued as soon as Elias mentioned Annalise. "She's cursed," he said with a grim smile. Her first owner, a girl named Eleanor, vanished without a trace. Since then, tragedy has followed her. Scoffing at the idea of curses, Mara persuaded Elias to let her photograph and research the doll for an article. Reluctantly, he agreed but issued a stern warning: do not open the case, no matter what you hear or see. As Mara snapped photos, the doll's eyes seemed to gleam unnaturally under the shop's dim lighting. That night, Mara couldn't shake the feeling that she'd brought something sinister home with her. The first incident occurred 3 days later. Mara woke up to the sound of faint tapping. She assumed it was the wind against her window. But as she got closer, She realized it was coming from inside her apartment. The tapping grew louder, leading her to her desk where her camera sat. The screen flickered on, showing an image she hadn't taken, Annalise's face. But her expression had changed. Her lips were slightly parted, and her eyes seemed to burn with malice. Over the next few days, objects in Mara's apartment began to move on their own. Lights flickered. Whispers echoed from empty rooms. And the faint sound of a child's laughter sent chills down her spine. Convinced it was just stress playing tricks on her mind, Mara resolved to finish the article and return the doll. But Annalise had other plans. During her research, Mara discovered an old newspaper clipping about Eleanor, the doll's original owner. Eleanor had been a lonely child who spoke of an imaginary friend that her parents believed was Annalise. After Eleanor disappeared, her family reported hearing her voice crying for help, but they could never find her. A diary entry from Eleanor's mother painted a chilling picture. Eleanor says Annalise doesn't like when I call her a doll. She says Annalise is alive. That she whispers secrets only Eleanor can hear. Last night, I heard a voice coming from her room. But it wasn't my daughter's. As Mara read, the temperature in her apartment plummeted. The faint sound of a music box began playing from nowhere. She turned to see Annalise sitting on her coffee table, though she had never brought the doll home. Terrified, Mara tried to leave, but the door wouldn't budge. The doll's head turned slowly to face her, and the lights in the apartment went out. "Play with me," a childlike voice echoed, though the doll's lips didn't move. Mara tried to reason with it, but Annalise wasn't listening. Instead, shadows began to swirl around the room, forming the shape of a young girl with hollow eyes and a sinister smile. "You brought me back," the shadow whispered. "Now, you'll take my place." Desperate, Mara remembered Elias's warning. If she could get the doll back to the shop and seal her in the case, perhaps the curse would break. Clutching the doll, Mara fled into the night. The journey to Wicker's relics was a nightmare. Annalise writhed and screamed in her arms, her porcelain face cracking to reveal a grotesque, shifting form beneath. Cars swerved as shadowy figures darted in front of Mara's path. But she pressed on. Bursting into the shop, she found Elias waiting, as though he'd known she would return. Together, they performed an old ritual Elias claimed would trap the doll's spirit. As they chanted, the shadows in the room coalesced, screaming and clawing at Mara. With one final incantation, the glass case glowed, sucking Annalise and the shadows into its depths. Silence fell, and the doll sat motionless, her cracked face once again serene. Mara moved far away, vowing never to write about cursed artifacts again. But Wicker's relics remained, and so did Annalise. Years later, a young couple stumbled into the shop, intrigued by the eerie doll in the glass case. Elias was gone, and the new owner didn't know the doll's history. With a cheerful smile, he handed them the key to the case. As the glass door swung open, Annalise's eyes sparkled, and the faint sound of a child's laughter echoed once more. Story 3: The Curse of Emily's Doll. When Emily turned 6, her grandmother gifted her a porcelain doll, a family heirloom passed down through generations. The doll had intricate lace attire, unnervingly glassy eyes, and an unsettling lifelike smile. Her grandmother claimed the doll would watch over her, but there was something about it that made Emily's mother uneasy. "Maybe it's too old for her," Emily's mother suggested as the little girl hugged the doll tightly. "Nonsense," the grandmother insisted. This doll has been with our family for over a century. It's a protector. Emily named the doll Clara and refused to part with it. She played with it during the day and placed it on a special shelf in her room at night. But soon, Emily's innocent joy began to turn into something far more sinister. A week after Clara arrived, Emily's mother, Sophie, noticed changes in her daughter. Emily, usually cheerful and energetic, became withdrawn and irritable. She often talked to Clara as though the doll could respond. Sophie dismissed it as a phase until strange noises began to fill the house at night. It started with faint scratching sounds coming from Emily's room. Sophie assumed it was mice and set traps. But the noises persisted. One night, Sophie awoke to the sound of muffled whispers. She tiptoed to Emily's room and found her daughter sitting upright in bed, staring at Clara, who was now positioned in the center of the room. "Emily, what are you doing?" Sophie asked, her voice trembling. "Clara was telling me a secret," Emily replied, her tone devoid of emotion. "She's just a doll," Sophie said, trying to reassure herself as much as her daughter. "No, Mommy," Emily whispered. "She's alive." Disturbed by her daughter's fixation, Sophie decided to move Clara to the attic. That night, Emily screamed so loudly it woke the neighbors. Sophie rushed to her room to find Emily trembling, tears streaming down her face. "She's angry," Emily sobbed. "She doesn't like being alone." Sophie dismissed it as a nightmare. But unease gnawed at her. She decided to research the doll's origins. Her mother, reluctant to share much, finally admitted the doll had a dark history. Clara had belonged to a distant relative named Annabelle, who had died tragically as a child. Annabelle's parents had the doll commissioned in her likeness, hoping to keep their daughter's spirit close. Over the years, stories of strange happenings and untimely deaths followed the doll. But the family dismissed them as superstitions. Sophie decided Clara had to go. That evening, she wrapped the doll in a blanket and placed it in the trash bin outside. Yet, when she returned to Emily's room, Clara was sitting on the shelf, her glassy eyes gleaming in the moonlight. From that night onward, the atmosphere in the house grew oppressive. Objects moved on their own, lights flickered unpredictably. Emily began speaking in a voice that wasn't her own, deeper, raspier, and far too mature for a child. One night, Sophie found Emily drawing disturbing images, crude sketches of Clara surrounded by shadows and figures with hollow eyes. Sophie demanded answers. But Emily simply said, "She's teaching me how to keep the bad people away." Sophie couldn't deny it any longer. The doll was cursed. She reached out to a local priest, Father Daniels, who agreed to perform a blessing. As he sprinkled holy water on Clara, Emily shrieked and collapsed. The doll's expression seemed to twist into a grimace before the porcelain cracked, releasing a high-pitched wail that reverberated through the house. Father Daniels declared the doll a vessel for a malevolent spirit and urged Sophie to destroy it. Sophie took Clara to an abandoned quarry, intending to burn the doll. As she lit the match, a sudden gust of wind extinguished the flame. The doll seemed to vibrate, emitting a low, guttural growl. "Leave us alone," Sophie screamed, throwing Clara into the pit. For a moment, silence. Then the ground shook violently, and a dark shadow emerged from the quarry, taking the form of a little girl with empty, glowing eyes. "You can't take her from me," the entity shrieked, lunging at Sophie. She stumbled backward, her mind racing. Desperate, Sophie grabbed a shard of broken porcelain and slashed through the shadow. The figure disintegrated with a bone-chilling scream, leaving behind only Clara's lifeless remains. Sophie returned home to find Emily sleeping peacefully. The first restful night in weeks. Clara was gone. But Sophie couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Months later, Sophie discovered a new doll sitting on Emily's shelf, a porcelain figure with glassy eyes and an unnervingly familiar smile. "Where did this come from?" Sophie demanded. Emily looked up, her voice eerily calm. "Clara said she missed me.